Hare Krishna. It is 8:13 in the morning here in Currumbin Beach, Australia, just south of Brisbane. Today, I would like to speak on a topic that was suggested to me. Here's the topic, the importance of knowing the difference between independent thinking, blind following, and following our guru's instructions, which could be philosophical or practical instructions. So it's a topic of authority, I suppose, in a spiritual movement. So first, we can trace some historical factors that led, I think, to a somewhat distorted picture in the early Hare Krishna movement of the balance between obedience, submission, or to use our word, surrender, and independent thinking or taking responsibility for your own life. First of all, when the movement began, when ISKCON began in 1966, and especially probably even more so as it spread the next several years, almost all the people who joined ISKCON were young, and almost all of them were coming from a Western background. And so what that meant is that the people who joined really not only didn't know the philosophy, didn't know quote unquote Vedic culture, they didn't even know, let's say, ISKCON standards of personal hygiene or whatever, hygiene and or how to take care of your health, or how to dress, because that also became an issue. Like that's the proper way to dress and the proper way to do everything. So because when ISKCON spread in the Western world, there was an idea that people had to undergo an extreme makeover in every sense. Like, you use different musical instruments, you cook food in a different way. It wasn't merely being vegetarian, lacto-vegetarian, but it was that, we cook Indian food and offer it to Krishna, and we dress a different way, and we dance a different way. And of course, we have completely different values. We have spiritual values. We have a philosophy. So you see everything in a different way. And there was a real sense in those early days that, not the earliest days, I should make a distinction, like 66, 67, even you could say 68, there was a little more, I don't know, tempted to say common sense. But once the Hare Krishna movement, by 69, I would say by the time I joined in 70 and 71, things really got into gear. There was this dynamic where the more the movement grew, the more visible we were, and the more we annoyed a lot of people. Because those were the days of the counterculture in the Western world, and there was a very popular slogan, "Don't trust anyone over 30" among the young people, and certainly people over 30 didn't trust anyone under 30. There's a real generation gap, and so we got a lot of negative response, basically from mature adults. I mean, young people, hippies, political radicals, and so on. We were exotic and different, but so was everybody else. We did get some resistance from the far left, because they were heavily Marxist, and they believed that religion was the opiate of the people, kind of mindlessly, repeating what Karl Marx said. Karl Marx is really kind of one of the great figures in history, since probably more people were killed in the name of his philosophy than in the name of any other philosophy. More innocent people were massacred, so that like about 10 to 20 times more people than were killed by Hitler. So that's a real distinction. That's why to this day on leftist college campuses, some people are proud to say they're Marxists, but somehow they're proud to identify with the most murderous ideology in the history of the world. But that's one of the many strange things about the world we live in. Anyway, but in general, I remember doing Harinam Sankirtan in San Francisco in 1969 and 70, and basically almost all the people that weren't just young people, they really didn't like what we were doing. They thought it was sort of like culture war that we had declared, and we were just coming out there in a very strange, crazy way, and promoting some kind of bizarre religion, and just not respecting any of society's standards. And that wasn't true, but it wasn't completely untrue in the sense that we had this radical view that the non-devotees were sort of hopelessly in illusion. Almost everything they didn't really do the right way, because they didn't know how to dress, how to eat, how to walk or talk, or they didn't know anything. They were just these hopelessly fallen, conditioned souls that didn't know Krishna and were nothing more than agents of the illusory energy. So the reason I mention this here in the discussion of authority is because when you joined the Hare Krishna movement back then, there was this real sense, which was, I suppose, kind of taught, or people picked it up, that everything I was doing before was wrong or illusory. Because even if I did something, you could say, which is not really wrong, like brushing my teeth or, I don't know, drinking water, but I didn't know how to brush my teeth or drink water because, of course, when you brush your teeth, you don't use Carmi toothpaste, you use Prabhupada's pharmaceutical formula of, what was it, mustard oil and salt, and just, so we didn't, and as far as drinking water, we didn't know to say Sri Vishnu. So even things like brushing your teeth and drinking water, we were an illusion, even doing those things. So, and therefore, but one consequence of that very radical extremist attitude is that, and when a young person joined, because that's basically, no one else joined except young people, 99%, then that person had to relearn everything. And so that person was seen as someone who's just coming from almost absolute ignorance and has to be taught everything. And then there was this trickle-down autocracy, just like we obey Prabhupada without question, so you have to obey us, Prabhupada's representatives. And of course, this was immature, but so were we. I remember when I was a new brahmachari, I'd probably been in the Berkeley temple for a few weeks, and the temple commander told me that I could not please Krishna unless I pleased him. So my entire salvation was in the hands of this temple commander who had been in the movement a few months longer than me. And I kind of started laughing when he said that because I just thought that's not really true. Of course, I was cooperative, I did my duties, but so there was this real thing of surrender. And then when, in 1972, when more devotees started taking sannyas, and of course that, you could say, increased the distance between ISKCON leaders, certainly sannyasis, and ordinary devotees, although they're basically the same age, and many of them have been in the movement about the same amount of time. But so, and then we had the book distribution revolution, and ISKCON was sociologically militarized, where it was kind of like the war theory of Lord Chaitanya's movement, where we, and of course Prabhupada said our temples are like military bases from which we go out to throw the bombs of these books. And so everything was highly organized, and if you wasted 10 minutes during the day, that was almost like eating red meat or something. So it was this highly militarized, highly disciplined, sort of woman denigrating culture, and of course the idea of surrender and the authority. And the idea was that if you join the movement, your only hope to make any advancement and not, just ruin your life, maybe for millions of lifetimes, was to do what the temple president said, or to do what the, whatever your authority said. And exactly how the temple presidents were supposed to make spiritual advancement, since often they were not obeying anyone except Prabhupada's general instructions, which oftentimes they didn't understand perfectly. There were a lot of fall downs among leaders. So, I don't just mean to criticize. It was a difficult time. It was a wonderful time. It was glorious. We were all young. And I don't want to blame people who were so young. You can't demand that someone be more mature than their age. The simple fact is that Prabhupada wanted older people to join. They just didn't. And so, of course, if someone's a leader nowadays and is not just a young guy and is still like a petty tyrant, then that's obviously another issue. So I'm going to start out with that I think ISKCON but after a few years, after by say 69 or so, 70, and certainly 72, when more people started taking sannyas, ISKCON became not only authoritative, but authoritarian. So where's the balance? Because as we know, anarchy is not a great idea. And we don't want chaos. And there is truth in the idea that by humbling ourselves and thinking of ourselves as servants of the servant of Krishna, we can make powerful spiritual advancements. So all that is true. So we certainly don't want to go to the other extreme. So where's the balance? What does it mean? What is a healthy society? I should also mention that the idea of sort of like mindless obedience, unfortunately, carried over, and I'd say more than unfortunately, in a very almost tragic way, carried over into marriage relationships. The idea of the husband as sort of God on earth for his wife. And it also carried over into the first Gurukul in Dallas and the attitude certain teachers had towards the children. So basically, ISKCON, I think it's fair to say, and again, I don't blame, it's hard to, where do you, of course you can blame people that really did terrible things. But at a social level, we were all young. As I always say, it's kind of like Vedic Lord of the Flies. We were all young. We didn't know what we were doing. And we were all kind of, I think, not everyone, but most people were contaminated by this very authoritarian culture because, as they say, power corrupts. I remember being young and thinking that power corrupts, but that doesn't apply to us. That's for non-devotees. I actually thought that. Of course, I was very young. I can plea insanity on grounds of youth, and they say absolute power corrupts absolutely. And of course, ISKCON dealt with this very powerful but very dangerous substance called absolute power. Because Krishna is the absolute truth. Prabhupada is his pure representative. Therefore, if you hold any position of authority, you could be the head bottle washer, you could be the Sankirtan leader, temple commander, temple president, which was one of the favorite positions to indulge one's, say, impure desires to be a tyrant. And so, whatever position one had, not everyone, but many, many devotees, they kind of got swept away by this idea that I have absolute power over another person. Because I'm representing Prabhupada to this person. I'm representing Krishna to this person. And therefore, absolute authority is coming through me to that person. And so again, ISKCON, I think, has matured a lot. But still, there are remnants and trace amounts, and more than trace amounts in some places, of this old tyrannical, authoritarian Prabhupada imitating leadership culture. And I don't mean to say that most leaders are like that now, or it's like that in most places, but it's not all gone. It's not all gone. That's why some of us have really been fighting to just establish justice, fair process in ISKCON, because the first thing tyrants do is just sort of abolish the Constitution because it's a nuisance, it restricts them. And so, I mean, there is a sincere effort now on the part of the GBC to draft a constitution. So I'm certainly not saying leaders of this movement are villains. I mean, from what I've seen being back in the GBC, that, I mean, I would say almost all of them are actually sincerely trying to do their service. But we still have a ways to go. Despite this sincerity, all of us have a ways to go. So now I'll get into some of the specific topics, like difference between independent thinking, blind following. Prabhupada discouraged blind following. Prabhupada encouraged what he called philosophical speculation. He wrote to me in 1971 that Krishna says, I'm the taste and water, or soham apsu konteya. So how is Krishna the taste of water? What does that mean? What does it mean to be the taste of water? Prabhupada said that's philosophical speculation, whereas mental speculation is if you question, is that true? Is Krishna really speaking the truth? Is he God? Is he the taste of water? That's mental speculation, which once you commit to Krishna, you hopefully don't do. And then, of course, the guru is as good as God, as Prabhupada said. He used to quote that verse, Yasya Prasada. I mean, the verse doesn't actually say as good as God. That's sort of a non-literal translation. Sort of an inference from what is said literally is Jasya Prasada, from whose mercy, literally, or by whose mercy, Bhagavat Prasada, there's the Lord's mercy. So to say that, so in that sense, if your goal is to get, sorry, that was a message. So it's not that what Prabhupada said is wrong, but it can very easily be taken wrongly. Again, the verse doesn't say the guru is as good as God, but you could say in terms of practical effect, if your goal is to get Krishna's mercy, then to get the guru's mercy will do it for you. So that is, getting the guru's mercy is as good as getting Krishna's mercy, because you do get Krishna's mercy. Or another verse which Prabhupada sometimes quoted, Jasya Deve Para Bhaktir, one who has sort of like the highest devotion or spiritual transcendental devotion for God, Jasya Deve Para Bhaktir, Jata Deve, and as much in God, Tata Guru, so much in the guru. There's one also has that same devotion for the guru. Again, it's not false to say in that sense that the guru is as good as God, but as Prabhupada also emphasized constantly, the guru is not God, and in many ways is not equal to God in some very significant ways. And so I would go further here and say, if you look at our culture, which came from, of course, from India, and there has been an East-West divide about how much is healthy in your submission to another human being. And there's always been an East-West divide. It goes back thousands of years. It goes back to the first seriously documented contacts between East and West took place between the Persian Empire and the Greek civilization, because that was the boundary. You know, on the Greek side it was West, on the East side it was East, and the cultures were very different. The Greeks were much more individualistic, free thinking, and they came up with an early form of democracy in Athens. And on the other side, the Persians, it was much more like, if you want to call it, at least what are images of Vedic culture and how much it actually matches real Vedic cultures and everything. But the image of just like submission, where, for example, in the East, people bowed down. They actually got down on the ground and touched their head on the floor and bowed down. People didn't do that in the West. The Greeks didn't do that. They thought it was like really a dangerous custom. The Greeks, and I mean, in some ways, because of the Eastern submission, they built a very large-scale empire. And in other ways, man for man, if you read the contemporary accounts, the Greeks, one really good Greek soldier was probably worth about 5 or 10 Persian soldiers. And if you look at the battles, the numbers, the Battle of Marathon and so on, and one reason is the Greeks were just like really sort of independent, tough fighters. Whereas on the eastern side, of course, they had great fighters too, but a lot of the soldiers, they had these huge armies that would just all run immediately if their leader was killed. They wouldn't stand and fight. And so they were very submissive. But when you're very, just like China, for example, in China they have a dictatorship, communist dictatorship. It's called command capitalism, where it's capitalism but under a dictatorship. And of course, the Chinese economy has grown. It's not famous for innovation. They basically copy what other people do, and because they have a huge population and up until recently very low wages, the Chinese economy is still growing. It's actually slowing. It's at its lowest growth rate in many, many years now. And so whether they can sustain this growth really remains to be seen. But China is not known for innovation, for creative. In fact, they are famous for stealing intellectual copyrights, because all kinds of things are invented in other countries where there's more freedom, and then they just steal it and mass produce it. And that's really at the center of the current trade war between the US and China. But in any case, so when you get all this submission, you don't get a lot of creativity, because if you have an idea which is different from the leader, you're in trouble, and the leader may not have that many great ideas. If you have a really genius leader who has just amazingly good ideas, then yeah, it may work for a while until the leader dies and you get his usually incompetent son that takes over, which is what usually happens in history. But so when you have this very submissive culture, a culture which places leadership on a high level, you also pay a price for it. You also pay a price for it. So I'm not saying we shouldn't be submissive to higher authority. That's not my point. I'm sure I know there are some people in the Hare Krishna movement that have this sort of infinite capacity to misunderstand what I say. They seem to really kind of like specialize in that. But if you listen carefully to what I'm saying, I'm not saying that we should not submit to a legitimate higher authority. But the way we submit and how we differentiate between a higher authority and a representative of a higher authority, and to what extent the representative is transparent, to what extent the representative is not transparent, is an issue. So in the Hare Krishna movement, certainly at the center of it, it very much has this Eastern notion of extreme submission. I'm not criticizing that. I'm just saying it exists. And so, for example, bowing down even if you look at, if someone is actually a pure soul or a pure representative of Krishna or God, then in a sense, the more you submit, the better. And in our tradition, the great acharyas, including Prabhupada, we have truly pure souls, which is an extraordinary, really, almost I want to say, unique opulence, spiritual opulence we have. And so you get these very strong, very strong statements, like there are songs that say that H.D.Goswami, that the H.D.Goswami Muitaro Das Mora Tahara Padarenu Mora Panchagras, that it's a famous Vaishnava song that 6 Goswamis, I'm their servant, and the dust of their feet is my food. So to someone who is not accustomed to these extreme levels of purity and the extreme levels of submission that in a sense are not extreme because they're reciprocal with the level of purity, that when dealing with souls who are so great, whose purity is so extreme, in a sense, by great submission, we're not really going to extremes. We're simply submitting in a way which is proportionate to the purity of the people we're surrendering to. I actually understand that. I actually know the philosophy of the Hare Krishna movement. However, when we are dealing with representatives who are not let's say, at extreme levels of purity, just unearthly levels of purity, then saying like, like the dust of your feet, I will eat the dust of your feet as my food, it can seem a little strange, and it can have unintended consequences, both in terms of the consciousness of the person who's receiving such submission and in the person who is submitting. So I think it really is an issue for the Hare Krishna movement to say, given the reality of the world, that at the present time, there are many, and I mean this very sincerely, many really wonderful devotees in ISKCON, men and women, and even children. I mean, many really exceptional Vaishnavas. And at the same time, to the best of our knowledge, none of us are on Prabhupada's level. And the difference between us and Prabhupada, to the best of our knowledge, is significant and not trivial. It's not like Prabhupada is a 93 and I'm a 91 or something. It's not that. It's a significant difference. And therefore, to what extent do we keep the same levels of extreme submission? And at times it kind of turns into mindless submission, which Prabhupada didn't ask for even for him. To what extent is that healthy? To what extent is it even possible in the Western world to spread a movement that still very much engages all kinds of rituals and language and you could even say administrative structures which embody extreme submission? Is that something which really can or should be preserved and promulgated? Or is it the case that such extreme levels of submission are not really healthy or even appropriate given the actual levels of spiritual advancement? And again, there are many wonderful devotees in ISKCON. There are many wonderful gurus and sannyasis and men and women and householders and children. I mean, there are many special advanced souls in Prabhupada's mission. I know that. So I'm not saying everyone's a bum. That's not the point. But should we, and of course in India, that was very normal. You bow down on the ground. You bow down on the ground. You're very submissive. I read an article that said that in India, even billionaires in India, and men who are billionaires and big political leaders will not make any important decision without talking to their mother. And we see, for example, in Indian culture that even to this day, despite all the modernization, there is a level of family attachment and submission to the wish of your parents, which really goes beyond what we see in the West. It goes pretty far beyond. And in a sense, this is not merely Indian, it's Eastern. For example, in China, someone's last name comes first. In the West, it's the first name and the last name. But in China, you say the last name first. Why? Because that's really who you are. Your group identity is more important than your individual identity. Also, we find in Asia, throughout Asia, even among Buddhists, a very strong tradition of ancestor worship because there's so much family attachment that you really worship your ancestors. Now, I grew up in a Jewish home where every year on the anniversary of passing away of my father's relatives, his parents or his younger brother passed away in World War II, that he would light a memorial candle and observe certain religious rituals or just certain prayers for his family. So it's not that in the West these things don't exist, but I think it's absolutely fair to say that in the East, ancestor worship is much, much stronger than in the West. So again, you get stability from that type of very conservative, you get a certain cultural or social stability. You also get a lot of bodily consciousness. So that India probably has the most severe social hierarchy of any country in the world. in terms of how lower class people are treated. The governments in India have tried very hard to change this. They've passed innumerable laws. So all the good, right laws are on the book, but this type of severe social hierarchy has a very long shelf life in India. It's not going away, despite all the modernization. You could say maybe it's going away to some extent, but it's just incredible how strong it's been and how strongly people identify with their extended family. And so, so in a sense, it's not just trying to convince Western people like God is a blue cowherd boy, which is, I think is a great idea. I mean, I'm really happy that Krishna manifests in that way, that's his pleasure to be a beautiful blue cowherd boy. I think, so I don't have to be happy with anything else now that I've become used to it. You really understand who Krishna is. So it's not just a question of convincing people that Krishna is God. It's not just a question of convincing people the power of the Maha Mantra. There's a whole very, very Eastern culture which comes with it. And of course, devotees tend to say that's Vedic culture. To some extent, some parts of it are. There's a huge amount of it that many people call Vedic culture. It's really just Indian culture. And, I won't go over the whole list. I mean, we could go on all day listing all the things that some people call Vedic culture, but actually are not necessarily Vedic culture. They're Indian culture. One thing is this whole, frankly, I have to say it, and it's just me. I'm not claiming that. This whole thing of, all women are Matajis, Prabhus and Matajis. So that if I meet a woman that's, 40 years younger than me, she's Mataji, or someone with whom my relationship is really brother and sister is Mataji. Actually, that's not Vedic culture. Chanakya Pandit said, see other people's wives as mother, but read the Bhagavatam. That's our main Shastra, or the Gita, or the Mahabharata, and make it count how many times a man addresses a woman that's actually not his mother as mother. Make a list. And to see how many times men address women who are not their mother by their names, or by non-maternal respectful titles like Shubhe, which means like good lady, or Badre, same thing, noble woman. So it's just not there. It's just not there. Men do not call all women mother, they call their mothers mother. Or even in our culture, someone's like the age of your mother and the relationship is maternal, then it's not a big deal. But the idea that you call all women mother, it's not in Shastra. There's all kinds of things like that. I mean, there's just, again, I don't want to make this talk about that now, but believe me, it's a very long list of things that we call Vedic culture that are not in Shastra. So, I think this is at least, I don't want to give all the answers here. I think since I've already been speaking for 33 minutes, and apparently the longer you speak, the less viewers you have, and since I'm really lusting after big numbers of viewers, anyway. But I think this is a good topic. This whole thing, this East-West thing, and should we train people to be, Prabhupada said, independently thoughtful. One of the questions I was asked is, independent thinking. Prabhupada said the whole purpose of the Hare Krishna movement is to make people independently thoughtful, and then if one big leader decides for everyone, whether it's a guru or a sannyasi or a GBC, I mean, there are some things that the leaders of ISKCON should decide because that's their job, and they can do a reasonably good job at it. But this totalitarian idea, the idea that if you're really surrendered to Krishna, you basically remain for the rest of your life a mental child, and someone else decides everything for you, That's the opposite of what Prabhupada wanted. The purpose of ISKCON is not to keep people as mental children until they died 80 years old or something. The idea is to train people to be mature, thoughtful, independent people who can do intelligent things, make right decisions by themselves because they're mature adults. And of course, we belong to a religious institution. They're leaders of religious institutions. By definition, they have to be managed. There have to be rules. There is an administrative hierarchy. There's even a spiritual hierarchy. I'm not trying to banish all hierarchies, whether administrative or spiritual. There are natural and necessary hierarchies, but they can get out of control. And they can be too extreme, and they start to become an impediment to spreading this movement rather than a necessary condition for spreading the movement. And so we need to think about these things. We need to talk about these things intelligently. So I'm just going to check very quickly to see if anyone here on Facebook asked a question. Or let's see. Okay, here's one from, do you think it became more an organized religion instead of a movement to spread Krishna consciousness? To some extent. I mean, it should be an organized religion. So I'm not saying, it's not like, do you want to be a spiritual movement or do you want to be an organized religion? To be a spiritual movement, I think you also need to be an organized religion. It just has to be organized intelligently. And we don't want chaos, and we don't want tyranny. We don't want extremes. Extremes are not sustainable and they're not healthy. No tyranny, no chaos, anarchy, but an intelligently organized Hare Krishna movement. Thank you. Someone sent a very nice comment. Tulsi Devi Dasi, thank you. And from La Ciudad de Mexico. So thank you all very much for kindly watching. And Baliji, yeah, thank you all very much. I really appreciate your taking your valuable time to listen, and I hope this has been helpful in some way, and see you again soon. Hare Krishna.